This is meaningfully different than any technology we've seen in the past. This is going to change customer service forever. Once you believe that, the next step becomes pretty obvious. If we don't build this, somebody else will do it to us. Tony, I worked for at the ice cream business. He'd ask questions like, hey, it's such and such included in your forecast model? There's no way of knowing what it's going to be. His response to that was exactly what you said. It's, well, you know, it's not zero.
Benioff of Salesforce is famous for knowing the average quota per rep per segment. So he can go into a meeting and just be like, we'll add 5 reps there, X times Y equals this.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you have the demand gen, yes, you can do that. I think we were first in market with an outcome-based pricing model. Instead of the tool that facilitates the work of humans, you're selling the work itself.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Welcome back to Run the Numbers, the show where we talk with the world's top CFOs. I'm CJ, a tech CFO, and my goal is to tease out the playbooks and tactics the best finance leaders rely upon to make you better at your job. On today's show, I'm speaking with Dan Griggs. Dan is the CFO of Intercom, where he's helping steer the company through one of the most successful pivots in SaaS, into the AI era. Before joining Intercom, Dan worked across CPG, ad tech, and enterprise software, including a stint in the ice cream business. Yes, actual ice cream. He said that SaaS is easier than ice cream because it doesn't melt, but it turns out the forecasting lessons from perishable goods still come in handy when you're staring down something truly unpredictable like generative AI adoption curves. In this episode, we go deep on why it's not zero. It might be the best forecasting advice you'll hear this year, how Intercom landed on 99 cents per AI resolution for one of the fastest growing AI products of all time, Fin, what it's like to build an AI product that could eventually cannibalize the one that made you, and how Dan thinks about resource allocation between the reliable SaaS core they have and the AI-powered unknown. If you like this show, please remember to like it and subscribe. It helps us with the algorithmic overlords. And if you're looking to hire the best finance and accounting talent, I'd love to help you. I have a recruiting service that will pair you with qualified and amazing candidates from our warm database of newsletter readers and podcast listeners. The type of folks that self-select into reading about net dollar retention rates on weekends. If that's of interest, shoot me an email at talent@mostlymetrics.com and we can talk. Let's get into it. Here's my combo with Dan Griggs. Dan, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Yeah, CJ, I'm glad to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
I've had this interview on my bucket list for a while. I'm glad you're here. And I want to talk about Intercom and all the cool stuff that you've been jamming on. But before we talk about Intercom, Dan, you started your finance career working in consumer packaged goods for, of all companies, an ice cream company. You gotta take me through that, because you've said that SaaS is easier than ice cream because it doesn't melt.
That's definitely part of why it's easier. Yeah, I started out coming out of grad school at much bigger companies, one of which was Nestle and the ice cream division. So here in the Bay Area, that's Dreyer's ice cream, and Haagen-Dazs and all the Nestle ice cream sandwich products, all those kinds of things as well. Obviously, very different type of company than technology companies, SaaS companies, but an incredible, proving ground, learning ground. Obviously, very different things in the sense that, of course, you focus on the things you do in a SaaS business, understanding your competitive market, segmentation, channel strategy, how your growth strategy, margin profiles, things like that. But, there's just a lot of things that you don't have to think about in the SaaS world. You've got cost of goods that are made up of ingredients for making ice cream, pricing of the raw materials associated with those things. There's distribution of the product that is all logistics as opposed to distribution as we think about it for software, inventory to manage, CapEx to invest in factories and trucks and freezers and warehouses. So it's just much more operational, logistical, things like that. But what it taught me probably most meaningfully that I've brought to my career today is just the lessons of go and learn how the operations of the business work, get into the field. And they were very good at this. They were intentional about getting even junior folks onto the ice cream truck, delivering ice cream into grocery stores and in the warehouse, picking ice cream product off the shelf to package it up for an order. It just gives you a much more tangible understanding of the mechanics of the business, the jobs to be done across the organization, the time and work and materials involved, and some of the just practical realities of doing the job. So it's something I encourage my team to do, is to really understand the jobs of the people in the organization, even in a SaaS world. Like, what does a day in the life of a seller look like, or an SDR? It gives you a mental model of how to think about how the actual activity that's going on in the business connects to the people doing that work, and thus the financials associated with the people and the business you're trying to grow.
Well, speaking of that mental model, you said you were out in the field. So I'm guessing you were seeing people, maybe even helping unload some of these trucks. You probably build this mental model that you can't get from a spreadsheet of, well, they have to back the truck into this part of the warehouse. They have to load it up. You have to drive. Sometimes the route changes because of traffic. You get to the store. You have to put it on something to wheel it in. Then you have to find the aisle. And I'm probably not describing it right, but there are all these intermediary steps that you can't get just from the spreadsheet.
Those are so important to understanding the work being done, and any 1/10 of a point of margin matters. You're always looking for efficiency gains and ways to build productivity into the operational motions of the business. You've always got top line growth goals, but in every plan, you're going to have productivity improvement goals. You have to understand the practical realities, exactly as you described them, of what's possible and what's not. Otherwise, you're going to set ambitions, or you're going to target goals in parts of the business where they're just not realistic. For a seller, there's work they're doing in the systems they interact with. When they're looking in for information to help support a conversation with a customer, they're looking it up in systems A, B, C, and D. And, the more complex that is, or the more fragmented it is, or the number of steps involved, the degree of automation, that stuff matters.
I remember I asked this sales rep, Kenny, there's a different tag in Salesforce. We were selling into auto mechanic garages. And I was like, hey, from now on, can you ask all the reps to put how many bays are in the garage? This wasn't a field in there before. He said, I'll do it. I need you to go in, CJ, and try to log like a dummy account. I want you to see what we go through each time we have to enter this in. And I came out of it like, holy shit, I've been asking these people to log 12 different things. That slows them down if they're on the phone all day.
It absolutely does. I mean, there's a cost to any additional field of data that you want to capture. And even the decision of, do I make it a required field to populate versus one they can choose to or not? Like, that matters. It's an additional conversation or question that they're asking of a customer, and it's the step in the system itself of flagging it and selecting it in the dropdown.
Well, Dan, your former boss, Tony, president of the ice cream division, he had this great quote, it's not zero. What's your interpretation of that, and how do you apply that mindset to forecasting when you're staring down something that may be unknowable?
Tony, I worked for at the ice cream business. We'd sit in review meetings with him, and whether it was to review forecasts or to review, financial results or whatever it might be, particularly in forecasting, he'd ask questions like, hey, so it's such and such included in your forecast model? Some new thing we learned about a change that was going to happen in the business or dynamic in the market, whatever it was. A lot of times when those things are unknowable, especially earlier in your career as a finance person, you're like, there's no way of knowing what it's going to be. His response to that was exactly what you said. It's, well, it's not zero. And, you kind of sit in the room awkwardly and you're like, well, okay, you're right. It's not zero, but I don't know what it's going to be. So, and as finance people, I think by nature, early in our careers, there's a discomfort with making things up. You have to get comfortable with that over time, especially in the technology world where things change so fast. And there is a lot that is unknowable. I was part of, interviews over the course of my career where companies would ask things like, how many tires are in the United States? I think the one that you hear about often is like, how many Starbucks are there? Things like that. And of course, you don't know the answer to the question, but, you have to be able to use logic and intuition and just rational approaches to coming up with something. And in the face of ambiguity, you've got to be willing to do that. Maybe whether it's you start with like, okay, well, what's the size of the market for companies that might be willing to buy something like this? And what size of deals might be realistic, and find ways to come up with what assumption might make sense for that. And you're going to be wrong. Of course, you're going to be wrong, but you can come up with like a range of outcomes. Well, if this assumption is this, or if it's 5 times this, you can come up with a range of outcomes, and then gather input over time from other folks in the organization or even customers to refine those over time. But it gives you something to start from and work with to have a conversation about it and help to inform decision making. So it's valuable regardless of its in precision.
We were talking to Brian Brown, the CFO of Rocket Mortgage recently, and how his team goes about forecasting. They are very impacted by interest rates and what happens in the macro environment. And he said that they do a daily forecast and scenario analysis. It's a what if.
Because you need to know the envelope of possibilities that could happen. It was a similar thing for us in the ice cream business, like diesel fuel. We were always trying to estimate what diesel fuel costs were going to be, or milk, those things fluctuate. So every business has got its own version of it, and you just have to get comfortable with making shit up, for lack of a better way to put it.
There's something also, though, incumbent on the managers. If you ask your team to take those leaps of faith, you can't burn them when they come back and it is inevitably wrong. You have to give them that surface area to come up with that guess.
Yeah, there has to be that psychological safety associated with. Part of that's the empowering them to make stuff up side of it. And part of it is okay, now what do we do with it from here once we start learning more and things actually happen?
Well, to that point, once things actually happen, I look at those exercises many times, Dan, as just having something on a page that I can toggle after once I do have some data. At least you've done the work to set it up.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Then you can start taking all those assumptions that you had to make up a range of possibilities for, and you refine them further. And it then narrows more and more the range of outcomes that spit out the other end of the model. That's exactly right.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Well. Here's what nobody tells you about being a CFO. You'll spend 50% of your time on stuff that is killing your momentum. The best CFOs I know are business leaders who know how to drive growth in heroic fashion. But most of us end up spending our days buried in manual work. I'm talking about collecting receipts, reviewing expenses, and manually reconciling spend. It's painful. That's why CFOs need Brex. Brex built an intelligent finance platform that pairs corporate cards with built-in expense management, plus a team of AI agents to handle the manual finance tasks for you. That way, CFOs have more time for the high-impact projects that drive growth. The shit actually worthy of your CFO time. Bottom line, Brex is automating hundreds of thousands of hours of manual finance work every month across 35,000 companies like Anthropic, Coinbase, and DoorDash. Ready to spend less time buried in expenses and more time driving results? Check out Brex at brex.com/metrics. It is brex.com/metrics. Please, guys. How the hell do I have 3 kids in daycare? Brex.com/metrics. You just launched your new AI product. The new pricing page looks great. I'm talking crisp. But behind it, last-minute glued code, messy spreadsheets, and running ad hoc queries to figure out what to bill. Customers get invoices they can't understand. Engineers are chasing billing bugs. Finance can't close the books. Well, with Metronome, you hand it all off to the real-time billing infrastructure that just works. Reliable, flexible, and built to grow with you. They turn raw usage events into accurate invoices, give customers bills they actually understand, and keep every team in sync in real time. Whether you're launching usage-based pricing, managing enterprise contracts, or rolling out new AI services, Metronome does the heavy lifting so you can focus on your product, not your billing. That's why some of the fastest growing companies in the world like OpenAI and Anthropic run their billing on Metronome. Visit metronome.com to learn more. That's metronome.com. Here's a growth tax nobody talks about. Every new monetization model you ship creates a nightmare for your finance team. Add usage-based pricing? Now you're tracking consumption against commitments. Launch product bundles? That's multiple performance obligations per contract. Offer mid-cycle upgrades? Woo! Good luck reallocating revenue manually. But that's exactly where RightRev shines. RightRev is the revenue recognition engine built for companies that can't afford to let accounting slow down growth. When your rev rec is automated, your product team can ship new pricing without asking finance for permission. And your sales team can close creative deals without worrying about downstream chaos. To get up on my CFO soapbox for a sec, I love talking about creative pricing models, hybrid pricing, credits, tiered usage. But I've seen too many companies where the sales team is celebrating a huge quarter while finance is still trying to figure out how to recognize half of it. In a world where your pricing model might change 3 times next year, that flexibility is everything. If you want to scale your monetization without breaking your books, visit RightRev.com. That's RightRev.com, where modern monetization meets bulletproof accounting. What's another lesson from your career that you use every day?
Just to have I'll call it like a back pocket set of numbers, but really it's not in it's in your head. What are the kind of key metrics of the various components of the business that you might need to be able to do mental math with on the fly? Could be average quota per rep. I'm thinking a SaaS business. It could be, what's the average salary of somebody in the R&D organization? It could be what's the ratio of sellers to SDRs or sales engineers. But it's important that you have those things in your head, even if they're just close to right. It just puts you in a position to do quick mental math on things. And that quick mental math serves you in a number of ways, right? When you're looking at numbers, somebody's presenting either actual results or a forecast, it allows you to sanity check things. That number doesn't look right. Something's wrong with that. If it's actual, maybe something's wrong with the underlying data. And if it's a forecast, like, something flawed in the assumption that we're using there, because that doesn't jive with whatever this, shorthand that you're using in your head tells you. It also serves to just help you connect the dots through the organization. A change in one thing over here is going to have this impact to other things over here, whether it's logo growth or headcount changes. If I'm adding more sellers, what does that extrapolate to in quota capacity and the upside to revenue? Or we're struggling to hire account executives. What risk does that put into the business? Like, the ability to do that in real time is huge.
This is the stuff that people come to the podcast for. And I think what you're getting at is having a list of input metrics that you can flex to come out with these kind of looser output scenarios. So an example that comes to mind is Mark Benioff of Salesforce is famous for knowing the average quota per rep per segment. So he can go into a meeting and just be like, well, add 5 reps there, the X times Y equals this.
Yeah, as long as you have the demand gen, yes, you can do that. But yes, that's a great example of the kind of thing that, you want the mental math to be able to do. It helps you solve problems. In that example you just shared, Mark's trying to solve for gaps, presumably, or a growth rate that he's trying to achieve, or whatever it might be. And whether it's you're trying to solve for something like that, or you're trying to solve for cost savings or margin improvement, that shorthand gives you the mental math to come up with how you might get there and what has to be true in order to get there.
Just to stay on this for a second, because people always benefit from the really specific examples. One was average comp for an engineering hire or something like that. Can you just give us a quick list of some ratios that you're always using in some form to vet your decisions?
Yeah. Some of them are going to be obvious. Average salary per engineer. You mentioned average quota per rep. Ratios between different types of headcount in your sales organization.
Pod ratios.
Yeah, exactly. Like pod ratios in R&D would be how many product managers in a pod and how many engineers in a pod. If your R&D organization thinks in terms of teams or pods, and they want to add a team, you know exactly how much that costs. It could be translating, new ARR or upside or downside in ARR to cash flow. That's a mental math I do all the time, and that's a function of not just what that new ARR number is, but the billing frequency that you have in the business. Are you invoicing customers up front for annual contract? Having that mental math allows me to come up with cash flow on the fly in my head when I think of things like that. The margin for different products, and that's becoming an increasingly important thing in a world where companies have both SaaS products and AI products with different margin profiles. Greater growth in one or the other will have implications for what you get out of that greater growth. It's a constant thing. Even sitting in a meeting with the team working on a forecast model, we'll sit there and we'll say like, we're trying to solve for X thing, whether that's a growth number or a margin number, or a cash flow number, whatever it might be. You start thinking about what levers can I pull to move the needle on that? Okay, I can pull this lever a little bit. That's going to be worth this in terms of solving whatever gap I'm trying to solve. I can pull this lever and that's going to be worth this. And you kind of do that mental math as you go, and you agree with the team. Here's what I want you to go tweak. But you already kind of know in your head what you expect to see when it comes back. And then when it comes back, if it doesn't say that, then you got some questions to ask about why not.
Well, speaking of AI products, Intercom is one of the few companies that successfully pivoted from SaaS to AI. I want to go back, Dan. What was the burn the boats moment for you? When did you know we're all in on this?
A lot of credit for how fast we moved on this goes to our founders and AI leaders in the company. our founder CEO, Owen, returned as CEO after a couple years off in October of 2022, somewhere around there, and really refocused the business on customer service and becoming a leader in the category. And serendipitously, a few months later, the first real LLM as we know them today, GPT 3.5, was released, I think in November of 22, something like that. We had a team of AI ML engineering folks, and the leader of that team, was always staying up to speed on the technologies coming out in the category, and we were building our own models in sort of the old technologies that were available at the time, and very quickly reviewed it, evaluated it, and very quickly asked for time with Owen, our founder, CEO, and his co-founder, Des, to just convey it's different this time. This is meaningfully different than any technology we've seen in the past. The three of them over the next, few days, weeks, got together and, just very quickly built conviction that this is going to change customer service forever. Once you believe that, the next step becomes pretty obvious, scary, but obvious, which is to say, if we don't build this and transform our business with this, somebody else will do it to us. And so that's probably the closest thing to the burn the boats mindset. Within 3-4 months, we had the first version of our AI agent Finn in market, in beta, and we were in GA release, in May or June of that same year. So for us, it was much more obvious than I imagine it might be for a lot of companies because it was so clearly existential. So it was a big bet, but the right bet.
It feels like it was a pull in the moment more than a push.
So not a pull in the sense that customers were asking for it, a pull in the sense of, hey, once you sort of decide what the implication is of the technology for the category that you are in, customer service was a pretty obvious early
top
category.
of the list.
Yeah, exactly. Very soon after that, coding became, very high on the list, and there's probably still today a relatively short list of the most obvious, among which customer service probably remains at the top. And so once you accept that as a reality, your only choice is to go all in.
There's been this realization moment in B2B SaaS at different levels that some haven't had it yet. So customer support, it was a big aha. Then coding, saw the likes of Cursor, and started with GitHub Copilot and a couple others, and Anthropic's Claude. But I don't think we're fully there yet with a couple of the other categories. CRM hasn't, I don't think, had its aha moment yet. I think it's still a pretty short list.
It's a function of the degree to which the LLM technology is able to do the work itself. And this isn't a new idea, but if you think about traditional SaaS, it's about facilitating the work of humans, like the workflows humans are doing to do a job. And with AI, for a relatively small number of categories, it's doing that work instead. Customer service is an obvious one. Coding is another one that's emerged. Creative work, whether that's written or artistic, is one. Obviously, there's a bunch of copyright and trademark things that you got to deal with in that context. But, that's another one for which these AI tools are naturally suited to do the work that would otherwise be done by a person.
And I'm not convinced we're completely there yet with finance. I think within the next 18 months, we may have our moment. There is some really cool stuff going on, but I don't think it's been as big of an aha. It's a completely new way of doing things yet.
We're not there yet. I'm hopeful. We, by nature, I imagine, for most companies are more conservative in our willingness to totally transform, given the bar for precision. And there's some interesting things being worked on out there that I think have promise. And, I think we're going to start seeing real impact, like you said, in the next 12, 18 months.
The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Being a CFO, you know how much I love tools that actually make the lives of accounting and finance folks easier. One of my favorite tools right now is Rillet, the AI native ERP going head to head with NetSuite. Yes, someone is finally doing it. I met Rillet 2 years ago when they were still in stealth. Since then, they've absolutely taken the finance world by storm. Their mission is to make the zero-day close a reality, and they're actually doing it. Customers are literally closing their books at 1:35 p.m. on the first day of the month. They've got everything you need to scale your business. Complex revenue recognition, native integrations, custom reporting, multi-entity, close management, and much more. They're only a few years in and are already supporting NASDAQ publicly listed companies. Yes, Seriously. If you want to scale your business on an ERP that wasn't built in the 90s, you need to check out Rillet. Book a demo at rillet.com/CJ. Oh, cool, that's me. That's RILLET.com/CJ. RILLET.com/CJ. Tell them I sent you there. Ali and the team at Tabs are building something that directly addresses one of the biggest headaches I see finance teams deal with today. Pulling data from your ERP, your CRM, your FP&A tools, and your usage systems and actually making it all work together. If you're running usage-based pricing or complex contracts, you already know how this usually plays out. Contracts live in one system, usage data lives somewhere else, billing happens in another tool. RevRec gets layered on top at month end, and finance ends up just reconciling everything by hand to close the books. This is exactly the problem Tabs was built to solve. Tabs is an AI-native revenue platform built for controllers and CFOs. It brings together data from your ERP, CRM, and real product usage into a single system of record. From there, it automates billing, collections, and revenue recognition without finance having to duct tape workflows together every month. If usage-based revenue is core to your business, this is the future of how billing and RevRec get done. Go check them out at tabs.com/run. That's tabs.com/run. We've all been burned. We've all bought that enterprise planning tool that promised the world, only to realize 6 months later that we've basically taken on a second full-time job just to keep the software running. I want to talk about a company that was built specifically to kill that cycle, Abacum. I actually remember my very first conversation with their founder and CEO, Julio Martinez, over 3 years ago. Back then, they were just starting out in Spain. Fast forward to today, Julio moved the home base to NYC, and they're the engine behind finance teams at Strava, Replit, and JG Wentworth. Abacum doesn't turn you into a software admin. The integrations are actually self-service. You don't need a $300 an hour consultant to plug in your ERP or HRIS, and they're doing AI in a way that actually impacts the things FP&A teams are doing every day. Things like creating variance summaries, building formulas, and modeling scenarios. If you're scaling fast and you're trying to avoid that legacy platform trap, Abacum is the move. They're building the future of our tech stack, and they're doing it with a CFO's perspective. Go to abacum.ai to see it for yourself. That is abacum.ai. Can you explain how your usage-based model for Fin works today?
When we were first launching Fin and trying to come up with what kind of pricing model made sense, instead of the tool that facilitates the work of humans to do the job, you're selling the work itself. And so it was pretty obvious pretty quickly that seats didn't make sense because it wasn't humans using seats to facilitate their work. It started to become pretty obvious pretty quickly that we needed it to connect it in some way to usage, and maybe that was going to be how many conversations Fin was involved in, like attempted to resolve. Maybe it was going to be very outcome-based, both through some early customer research and just our own view of where we expected the market to go. We started pointing ourselves to an outcome-based pricing model. In the same way that customer service is an obvious use case for the application of these technologies, it's also one for which the impact it has is very measurable. And so an outcome-based pricing model for us is easy to conclude that that's the right answer because it's so measurable, which is to say, did it resolve the customer's conversation or question or problem or whatever it is or not? And that's a fairly binary thing once you decide what counts as a resolved conversation and what doesn't. And so it just very then directly connected the value that the technology is delivering to the way we monetize it and what customers pay for it. I think we were first in market with an outcome-based pricing model.
For those keeping score at home, I also thought you were the first in market with it. It spurred on an outcome-based revolution that we're now in the midst of. You mentioned that it's replacing the labor. It's 99 cents per resolution. Now, I've been a CFO at companies doing the back of the envelope math. I'm like, we're paying $20, $30 actually per support ticket to be resolved. That comes across as a bargain. Do you ever think how much value are we leaving on the table?
Certainly in the early days, I thought about that all the time. But look, we were really trying to optimize for removing barriers to trial and adoption with the assumption or the belief, the conviction that this was going to transform the customer service category, that we wanted to establish ourselves as a leader very early. That comes from customers and usage as much as it does from revenue. If you think back, There are a lot of memes out there about hallucination and, the risks associated with LLM technology communicating with your customers, and just an inherent, as a result, lack of trust by default, at least, for companies to allow this thing to talk to their customers. And so we needed to make it easy for them to try it out and see for themselves that it can really deliver high quality, instantaneous, human-like interaction and ultimately resolutions as a result. I think about it all the time still, as we look at our own research for cost per ticket, so to speak. You mentioned $20. That's not uncommon for SaaS companies, but there's all kinds of industries out there. For B2B, it's often on the higher end. For B2C, it's very commonly on the much lower end. And it has to do with the degree of complexity associated with conversations, how long each conversation takes to resolve. Not all conversations are equal in their cost. So we have companies with cost for conversations or for tickets at around $5, $6. Even then, they're getting a great bargain. They're getting a real ROI.
Can you speak to how not all conversations are equal? My aunt, who's 70 years old, she will probably talk to the Comcast bot for more than the 3 minutes, and I'm willing to talk to it. Can you say more about that?
It's true regardless of the type of company. So for a B2C company, take even something we can all relate to, like your cell phone bill as you're describing. You might be calling or writing in to say, how do I reset my password? Which is easy. A lot of companies would just put a link to a help center article on that.
Boom, you're done.
So with that, the LLM technology is great at just saying, oh, here's the step-by-step instructions. Let me know if you have any trouble. All the way to, hey, I'm trying to migrate my Verizon account to an AT&T account, but I want to bring my phone number over and I don't want to lose my contacts from phone A to phone B. And that's obviously a far more complicated conversation to tackle. And so the relative value being realized by a company is different in the automation of those things. Value realization for the vendor is, may or may not be different. Thus far, we continue to charge just 99 cents a resolution, and despite the fact that we are resolving more and more complex conversations with every new sort of iteration of the technology.
And I bring it up because when you model the unit economics of an AI resolution, Dan, what are the key drivers you monitor? Are you thinking compute costs, model retraining, latency?
As you might expect, right? As the technology, or as you build the capability to answer more and more complex types of conversations, you might intuit that means more tokens, more pings to the LLM underneath, as distinct from a simple informational type query. We look at that in the form of, just LLM cost per resolved conversation, per total conversations. Obviously, if we are resolving a greater and greater percentage of conversations, then that helps your economics. And our resolution rates have gone from when we first launched Fin and was about 25% of conversations were automatically resolved, to now we're north of 65, closer to 70%. So that helps our economics, which you can imagine that the more complex conversations require more LLM compute, more tokens per conversation, more cost per conversation. And so the mix of conversation types that customers are deploying Fin against and that Fin is able to resolve matters. But again, as we continue to deliver greater and greater rates of resolution, that helps the economics significantly as well.
How much are you able to benefit from the falling cost of running some of these models? And I ask because you see all the charts of it costs less and less, and it's Moore's law. But at the same time, is it kind of like nobody wants yesterday's newspaper? No one wants to play with the toy car that doesn't go as fast as the new remote control car?
What we use, or the way our models are built, and I'm not on the engineering team, so
I'm not either, so I won't be able to say if you're right or wrong.
It's not one model, it's many, many models underneath, for all the various components of a conversation that we're using these technologies to optimize the outcomes for, whether the outcome that we're trying to solve for is latency or response accuracy or tone of voice or whatever it might be. And so you're incentivized to optimize the model selection for each component of the conversation for the best performance. We continue to optimize for the best performance. And if for one part of the conversation, you don't get incremental performance for the use of the most latest generation LLM, then there's no need to use it. But for some of the more core parts of the functionality, we are always constantly testing the latest and greatest models to see if it outperforms the previous generation. And if it does, and meaningfully enough so, we're going to continue to upgrade to use it.
The way that an engineering friend explained it to me is, CJ, you've worked with me to budget for cloud costs before. I explained how we have different cloud environments based on the tasks. You wouldn't use the expensive one that's always revving in the background for this task that the engineering team does once a week. It's the same thing with large language models, that you don't want to throw the Ferrari at a task that requires a Honda Civic.
We too are building our own and testing our own models, and we've begun to replace parts of that model stack with our own trained models.
Oh, wow.
The fact that we have domain-specific content to use to optimize the performance of those models, gives us an edge as well. There's a cost and a performance edge when we start to replace sort of the off-the-shelf, more generic models with our sort of domain-specific homegrown models.
I'm laughing because I'm thinking about in forecasting the past, if I needed a plug to get sales reps to a certain attainment, you just budget for increased productivity year over year. Efficiency gains. I can't imagine having to try to figure out what the efficiency gains of performance in a model are going to be like.
That is a thing we are attempting to do in real time these days. Back to our conversation about the unknowable, this is an example. The either performance benefit or cost benefit of these custom models, it's unknowable, and you just kind of have to try it and see what you can learn.
Well, I guess more of a serious, perhaps philosophical question is, how do you think about the fact that you're selling a product that will, in the future, in the fullness of time, cannibalize the product that you came up on?
I was not immediately worried about that, but more mid to long term worried about that. I'm far less so than I was in the beginning. We've seen a lot of customers adopt Fin to great success, see automation rates, the percentage of their conversation volume automatically resolved by Fin in the 70s, 80s plus. Yeah, some of them over time might, reduce the number of offshored seats that they have, things like that. But by and large, we're not seeing a lot of direct cannibalization. Now, there may be, and there likely is a bit of that just in the rate of expansion of seats. So, customers kind of use the automation to allow their teams to kind of grow into greater and greater conversation volumes without adding headcount. Customers may start to redeploy those resources to focus more heavily on very high value accounts to provide a higher touch for those customers. They may even deploy those folks to more customer success type activities or opportunities that are available within a customer service conversation. So thus far, we've seen very little to no meaningful cannibalization of the core business. And even if we do start to see that in the fullness of time, you were doing some of the simple math earlier, like $20 a conversation versus the 99 cents we're charging. Even if it's $5 to $6 a conversation for the 99 cents we're charging, the ROI is there for the customer for sure. And for us, it varies quite a bit, but a human might answer 150, it might be 300, oftentimes it's 700, 800 conversations in a month. If Fin is handling all those conversations, you're talking 1.5x to 3x to 7x the revenue that you'd get from the customer using Fin than we would see from the customer using a seat. Driving the transformation makes sense, regardless of ultimately whether there's cannibalization.
So it doesn't sound like it's the old scenario where somebody's going from perpetual on-prem licenses to cloud SaaS ARR, and you got to take one line down to zero over time and build the other one up. It's more of a subtle mix shift over time.
Yeah, it's definitely more subtle than that. And even if it does happen, you're trading in the perpetual license to SaaS transition was like upfront revenue for recurring revenue, and retention rates became a bigger deal and all the things. It's more of like, hey, I'm trading dollars per seat at say $100 a seat for $300 of Fin. Okay, well, that's an easy trade to make for a company like us. And for the customer, it's an obvious trade to make because they're spending 99 cents a conversation instead of $5, $6 or even 20.
There are a lot of CFOs listening who have had multiple bosses over the years in the form of a CEO. You've had a founder CEO, you've had a professional traditional CEO, you've had a founder CEO again. How do you think about how they make decisions, just observing different types of CEOs?
I think it's a combination of decision making, and it's a combination too of what's the stage of the business or the landscape in which that business operates. This might be a bit obvious, but typically that traditional CEO is going to be in the more mature business with a very well-defined and fairly stable strategy and strategic direction. And it's much more a matter of driving consistent execution of that strategy, whether that's improving the speed of execution or optimizing productivity within execution, whatever it might be, and durability and scalability of execution. And the market relative to where I think a founder CEO tends to be more suited is just less dynamic. Obviously, founder CEO by nature is typically suited to that early company life where there's a lot of ambiguity. The landscape changes quickly. It requires a willingness to make big bets in the face of that ambiguity, operating more from fundamental principles and theses about what you bring to the market, where the market's going, and how you can disrupt it. Or, as in Intercom's case, a period that requires extreme transformation. Were Intercom to have had, as you described, what would be a more traditional CEO at the time these LLM technologies came out, I can fully expect that we would have evolved to the strategy we're focused on now over time, but I would not expect it would have happened nearly as quickly as we made it happen. And that's, again, a credit to Owen, our founder CEO, his co-founder, our AI team, who saw that very quickly and, had the courage to make that big bet.
In many ways, the CFO's job is to scaffold any blind spots that a CEO may have. Do you think your role changes or the blind spots that you help point out changes depending on if it's a traditional professional CEO versus a founder CEO?
I don't know that I'd describe it in the form of blind spots for either. It's more the error bars are wider in the world of a founder CEO, right? Just by nature of the fact that you're in a landscape that is changing more dynamically, the bets you're making are bigger, the stakes of those bets are bigger, as distinct from what I described for the more mature business that you might typically find a traditional CEO in, where you're executing a relatively consistent, stable strategy, and it's about optimizing performance, and the error bars are just narrower in that context.
Well, Dan, I'm going to take you into what we call our long ass lightning round. So I ask every successful exec who comes on the show, what's an example of something you've screwed up on the job before? It could be at Intercom or any previous role.
I hope this is true of everyone and not just me, but hiring. I've definitely hired the wrong person before.
We get that a lot.
Yeah. And it's an easy mistake to make because we're all human and trying to make judgments with limited information. I'd say a corollary of that is waiting too long to make a change with somebody that wasn't working out. That's a mistake I made earlier in my career that now I'm very careful to challenge myself to not make again. It's easy to fall into that trap.
I was listening to a podcast with Malcolm Gladwell. I know he's not a SaaS CEO, but he has a media business, and he was saying that he doesn't think there's actually a correlation between how rigorously you vet a candidate and their success, like the outcome of how good they'll be. And part of me was like, I think he's actually right that some of the people I thought I vetted the most worked out the poorest.
I mean, knowing Malcolm Gladwell, he actually studied the data.
He did have data.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that that's what the data says. Just by nature, you're making a decision like that on such limited information. There's so much is unknowable.
If you could tell your younger self something, knowing what you know today, what would you tell him?
Probably some version of trust your instincts, related to that kind of be honest with yourself about what your instincts are telling you. You often know when something isn't right. And I don't mean something isn't right like there's fraud or something like that in the business necessarily, but like something isn't working, whether it's in the business itself or it's with a team member in your organization. Whatever that thing is hard to face, or it's a reality that you don't like. Human nature, will train you to do things like avoid thinking about it, avoid facing it, talk yourself out of it being a problem. But more often than not, your instinct in the beginning is the right answer. And you have to be willing to trust that and challenge yourself to test whatever hypothesis your instinct is telling you objectively, and avoid the temptation to rationalize yourself out of it. It's a human weakness, so it's I think in many people's nature to do that. So hard to avoid sometimes.
You pointed out two things there, Dan. It's not just detecting if the gut instinct is right. It's having the courage to act upon it and not rationalize it away.
It is. It is. The rationalization is so easy to do. We all do it in our day-to-day lives for little minor things to big things. And for a million different reasons, because you don't want to hurt somebody or you don't want to have a hard conversation or the outcome that is implied by the thing that your instinct is telling you is negative. And it is. It's just human nature and something you have to guard against.
More of a technical one. Can you walk me through your finance software stack? What tools does your team use to get the job done?
So we're using NetSuite for our ERP, as most companies our stage are. We are using Zip for procurement. That's probably the one we picked up most recently. Pigment for our forecasting and planning tools just went live a few months ago. Tableau for dashboarding, reporting, our data warehousings in Snowflake. For billing, we were using Stripe. We transitioned from Zora to Stripe starting about a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Expense management? Anything good?
We use Expensify. We are very much looking for tools to drive automation. And a conversation I have with the team a lot is, hey, our default mindset here shouldn't necessarily be AI tools, that we should only be evaluating AI tools. There's so much hype and you put the label AI on something and it's sort of meant to give it instant credibility, but not all problems are suited to an AI solution. And automation ultimately is what we're after. And whether that's best served through the use of AI or not is a function of the problem that you're solving. That's something we talk about as we try to find parts of our technology stack or parts of our processes that we're looking to drive efficiency in.
Last one I got for you. What's the craziest thing you've ever had someone try to expense?
Something along the lines of they were doing a presentation at some big event and didn't have a suit or whatever it was that they needed to look professional on stage, and they attempted to expense clothing. And it wasn't cheap either. It was something, I'm no clothing expert, but it was something pretty exotic based on the price tag.
Hey, what does Deion Sanders say? Look good, feel good, play good.
There's truth in that. I can't debate Deion.
This has been a blast. Thanks for joining me, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, CJ. Thanks for having me on.
Run the Numbers is a mostly media production. Yelling and intro by Fat Joe. Artwork by Meg D'Alessandro. Show is executive produced by Ben Hillman. Nothing said on this podcast is intended to be business or investment advice. It's the sole opinion of me, a guy who feeds his dog way too much ice cream and has a history of net operating losses. LOL. If you like this podcast, hit subscribe and give us 5 stars. It will take 2 seconds and our algorithm overlords love it. Drink water, call your mom, and have a great day. Peace.